Bach Experience featuring Cantata 97. You guys can relax for a few minutes. You've got a couple minutes before I begin, so take your time. In the past couple of years, we have surveyed Bach's cantatas from the early part of his time in Leipzig, from the first year in Leipzig when he arrived, and he resolved to write a cantata every week, just like the preacher sermon every week. Bach wrote a cantata every week, and those cantatas, as we've learned, they have a composite text that started with the scriptural text, most often a psalm text, and then a poetic text that followed the lectionary readings of the day. And Bach really outdid himself in that first cycle of cantatas. And one wonders what the musicians, what the parishioners, what they must have thought with the amount that their ears were expected to take in from these early cantatas. There's so much that Bach was putting in them layer by layer, measure by measure, note by note. For his second cycle, the second year, he intended to, he had this one shelf now complete of a year of cantatas that I've written. Now for the second shelf, the second Jahrgang, the second cycle, as we say, Bach changed to using chorales as the pillar of the compositional unity for this cycle. So these are called chorale cantatas, in which instead of a biblical or scriptural text as the departure point, Bach uses a chorale. And the chorales, of course, beginning with Martin Luther, the chorales are the foundation of the Lutheran faith and the transmission of a theology. In a sense, the chorales, the hymn texts, wherever you have them, the hymn texts transcend whatever the sort of liturgical or theological movement is of the day. For Bach in Leipzig, there was a dialogue, let's say, between those who were more orthodox in their view of the theology and those who were interested in a more personal pietism at the time, and there were arguments and discourse and so forth in schools about this. But what remained a constant was the chorale, those texts that were the transmission of the faith. In a sense, the chorale tune, those texts were a stained glass window telling the story of a faith and a pillar on which you could rely for a tradition that was impermeable to taste at the time. So the second cycle features these chorale tunes. This is the 300th anniversary of the second Jahrgang. 1724, 1725 was the period for that cycle, and really represents a height or a zenith in that style from many composers from Bach's own family from generations before. Bach turned to the same style of composition later. He stopped writing the annual cycles after 1726 and had his attention elsewhere, but he had a nice couple of shelves of cantatas to draw on. Notably, some of the most famous of Bach's cantatas were written in 1730s, even 1740s, for various occasions, and Wachet Aufruf uns die Stimme is one of those. It's probably my favorite cantata, and that dates from a later period. But he draws on this chorale cantata style. Our cantata today, number 97 in Allen, meinen Taten, is one of these. It dates from 1734. We don't know particularly the occasion, likely a wedding that Bach wrote the cantata, but we don't have any other information other than that 1734 from the primary sources. It is a chorale cantata, and it's a special one in that typically when Bach set the chorale cantatas, there were opening and closing verses that he would take exactly from the chorale. And then within, for a recit or an aria, he might paraphrase what the chorale text said to fit the various poetic form or musical structure that was within. In this cantata, there are 9 movements, and there are 9 verses of Paul Fleming's 1642 chorale. So not quite 100 years after Paul Fleming wrote this text. It was very familiar and probably in use widely in Lutheran churches throughout Central Europe by Bach's time. But he sets exactly Fleming's text verse by verse, no deviation, and so the text represents really a unifying pillar around which Bach can do the most creative and marvelous things. So there's no deviation from that. There's exactly 9 verses, and the text that you have in the bulletin for today is exactly the Fleming text, and that's where Bach started and ended with regard to text setting. Of note, of these 9 movements, the chorale tune, now there's a chorale text and a chorale tune, and most often the tune that was associated with this chorale text was the familiar Innsbruck, and on the front of the bulletin, the opening of that tune is on the front of the bulletin. Bum, 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 bum. That's on the front of the bulletin here. And that chorale tune, O Welt, ich muss dich lassen, sometimes it's called, or Innsbruck, was by a late Renaissance, early Baroque composer, Heinrich Isaac. And about Innsbruck, it was a secular text at the time, but was adopted and taken up, and very familiar. It's in our hymnals today, in the Methodist hymnal, as O Food to Pilgrim's Progress, 631, I believe, I think in the Methodist hymnal. We will sing Innsbruck as our middle hymn today, and it's printed, let's see, Trust All to God the Father, in a text here by Paul Gerhardt. And this is taken from the Christian Science hymnal, as a matter of fact, because most Protestant hymnals, the Episcopalians, Methodists, Lutherans, all have this text as a Eucharistic text. This tune appears as a Eucharistic text. Here, the emphasis is on trust and faith, and that is the point of the cantata. There are 9 verses, and they are all in promotion of a boundless faith and trust in God's will. Trust in God's timing, trust in God's methods, trust in God's circumstances, trust in everything that comes to you, around you, for you in life is part of God's plan. And our role is to grow in faith. Our job is to lean in resolutely in acceptance and submission to God's will, God's all-knowing plan. And that is the model of faith for the believer that Paul Fleming puts out over the course of his 9 verses. And so I want to guide you through these verses in part, and we'll go fairly quickly. So come on down, Chapel Choir. We'll start with the opening movement. I just referred to this tune, Innsbruck. Now, in other chorale cantatas, Bach uses the tune throughout, just as he has used the Fleming text throughout. The tune only figures in the opening movement and the final movement, leaving the inner 7 movements without that tune present, but the Fleming text fully intact. There are plenty of instances where Bach uses just the tune alongside a completely different text, and the tune itself calls our ear, it evokes a different layer of theology. We've talked about that with the Matthew Passion before, and this spring when we come to the John Passion, we'll be performing for the first time at Marsh the 1725 version of the John Passion, the second version that Bach wrote, with substantial changes, but in line with this year dedicated to chorale-based composition, and we'll see how that influences his revision of the John Passion. But in this first movement, it functions very much like a chorale fantasia with the Innsbruck tune in the soprano part in long tones. So you'll hear that overlaid. The instruments here today, a normal complement of strings, violins, violas, 2 oboes, bassoon, and continuo normal orchestration, but are deployed at the beginning in the style of a French overture, with dotted rhythms, kind of a regal entrance. Might befit a wedding, for example. You can imagine a solemn procession at the beginning. And that changes to a vivace, a light dance-like vivace, over which the chorale tune is heard. The lower three voices, the alto, tenor, bass parts, derive their melodic material, imitative material, more from the instrumental motive of the vivace rather than the chorale tune, but they all support together. Before we play, I want to call attention to the structure of Fleming's text. There are 6 lines in each verse of Fleming's text, you'll see, and the rhyme scheme for that is AAB, AAB. Now, that means that lines 1 and 2 are essentially the same in rhythm, or same in meter and same in pitch, actually the same notes, as lines 4 and 5. And lines 3 and 6 are different. They have the same number of syllables, but they end in different cadences. So that structure of Fleming's text indicates a certain organizational structure for Bach as he goes forward in the piece. So you'll hear the 6 lines of the chorale tune as sung by the sopranos with essentially the same polyphony underneath for the first, second, fourth and fifth iterations of the chorale line. We won't do all of those just now. You have to wait till the 11 o'clock hour for that. But here's a little bit of the opening movement. That is the first half of the chorale. You've heard 3 statements of the chorale tune accompanied by a lot of notes from the instruments and from the other voices. Thank you, guys. Have a chair. We'll keep going forward. Interestingly, of these 9 movements, we've just heard the first movement, and the final movement is a chorale tune also. The next 7 movements, you would expect some sort of combination of recitative aria, something like that, that sort of Italian operatic innovation that Bach really adopted fully when he got to Leipzig. However, there are only 2 recitatives. They're both short, and number 2 is not a recitative, it's an aria for bass. Come on down, Devin. And Bach sets exactly Fleming's text, even for those recitatives. They're not poetic constructs. So there are 4 arias, 1 each for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Then there's a duet for soprano and bass that I might argue is a trio for soprano, bass, and bassoon. And then, of course, these two recitatives. But first, there is an aria for bass, and it's a continuo aria. So when you look at an aria, you see, obviously that it's for a certain voice part, and then there is an accompanimental line that the continuo typically plays, and most often there's an obbligato instrument, obbligato meaning sort of a featured solo instrument. And Bach will use all kinds of combinations throughout throughout. But this is called a continuo aria because there is no obbligato instrument, it's just continuo and the singer. So that puts extra, there are fewer things to hold on to, just these two voices that work together, and it puts more of importance on the continuo part. And here, the text from Fleming seems to focus on our life in labor and in toil, and that we should put our faith in God, whatever that labor and whatever that toil is. And there's an element even of Sisyphus in the second half of the introduction. You can imagine bum dee dum bum bum dee da da dee dum bum bum dee da da dee, so that you'll hear Stephanie and Justin will play this dee bum bum, an ascending line, but between each ascending note, it returns to the low note. Dee dum bum bum dee da da dee dum bum bum dee da da dee dum bum bum, which to me is sort of the nature of our toil. That's the sort of Sisyphus trying to climb up, but always returning to that low note. There's a weightiness to that gesture. In addition to that, there are lots of bizarre intervals, lots of thorny intervals for to play and to sing. Those to me also indicate the nature of our toil, our labor. Let's just have a little bit of this aria. Devin, thank you very much. So you hear Zorgen, and Devin has lots of melismas or long passages on Zorgen in trouble. So you can hear Bach working out that design throughout. The next aria, I'm going to skip the little recitative. The next aria, number 4, is one of my favorites in the repertoire, and it's for tenor soloist, continuo group, and the obbligato instrument here is the solo violin. The solo violin part is it's a complicated, difficult part because it has not only lots of notes, but it has lots of double stops and triple and quadruple stops, meaning that you stop a string, you put your finger down to stop a string, and you do stop 2 strings to play 2 notes at one time. And this is a wonderful sound. You can play harmony with yourself in that way. And this aria is a different take on our idea of faith. Here the idea is of mercy, trust in God's mercy and that nothing will harm me. And I'm going to invite Heidi and Patrick and Continuo to play an opening phrase or 2 of this aria so you can hear it. And as Heidi plays the opening ritornello here, to me, the double stops that you'll hear really from the third bar, fourth bar, represent a sort of a balm or a mercy. So there's an acknowledgement of a trial or tribulation or whatever I have in the opening bars, a sort of solemn going for it, and then the fourth bar introduces the double stop, and it seems a gentleness comes over the texture. And then another theme emerges in the fifth bar, which is dotted rhythms, and this is sort of a dauntless character that the person encounters. And then yet another in the seventh bar, 30-second notes, which have a sort of an adventure quality about them. So, and then those all end with more double stops in bar 11, as if to say, wherever I go, whatever the journey is, I will be in God's mercy. Shall we try? So very beautiful. And I don't know if you have that same sense about, is this on now? Is that on? Yeah. I don't know if you have that same sense about those double stops, but there's a warmth and an embrace about the harmony every time you have those, that punctuates each of those journeys. Then add a whole wonderful tenor part that is in concert with that. It's an extraordinary aria. Later on, the tenor sings the word nichts, meaning nothing. And that's punctuated by quadruple stops from Heidi. Nichts, nichts, and there's a sort of a defiance written in that element that I'll ask you to listen for in the coming hour. Thank you very much, Patrick. Then there's a pair, a recitative and an aria for alto. We can't, do you mind? And I want to just call your attention to probably the most vivid text painting that Bach has in the course of this cantata. Wekiat in number 6 in his aria, he says, whether I go to rest later or awake early, and lake-ish, lie I, lake-ish, lie down, or erwache, meaning to wake. And so when he sings lake-ish, lim ba ba bam bam bidam, he descends on a scale. But then when he sings erwache, it's the exact opposite. So there's a little bit of lying down and awakening that happens there, and I would like you just maybe to hear a little bit of that. Could we start, please, measure 5? This is number 6, measure 5. Number 6, measure 5. And very, very simple little idea that Bach puts in. He's not given to that sort of very obvious text painting too often, but that's an excellent one. Later in the aria, there are two words I call your attention to. One is Schwachheit. Schwachheit is in weakness. And almost every time Wiechat sings the word Schwachheit, it has a dissonance in either an interval or a borrowed tone, or there's an accidental in front of the notes or something like that. And the other word I would call your attention to, and maybe we could begin, we'll start at measure 29 in a moment. Measure 29 and go forward. The other word, other than Schwachheit, is tröstet, meaning comfort. And the point of this is that we find comfort in God's word. Tröstet in seinem Wort, in the word of God. Wort meaning word, but tröstet. And Wiechat has a beautiful, comforting melisma for tröstet. So listen for Schwachheit and tröstet, and we'll just go until about bar 40. Here's measure 29. The final two pairings of arias here, the first is a duet for bass soprano and continuo. And the continuo line is almost exactly material that the singers will sing. That is to say, you could add text to it and it would look just like a third vocal part. So to me, this duet really becomes a trio. And in some ways, this is the movement that most models the kind of faith that God requires of us. It is so complicated and it is so difficult that our ear can't quite take it all in at once. But we just have to trust that if we sing our line, play our line as Bach writes it, that, that all will come out correctly. It's complicated. It's complicated to listen to. It's complicated to do, of course, but the notes move at a fast clip, as does the text. And I will hear just maybe an opening phrase or two of this one. Could you keep up? Well done, you guys. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Finally, there's one final aria for soprano, and this aria will be sung by Logan Schroeder, and we'll do the first phrase. Is accompanied, the obbligato instruments here are two oboes. And one of the commentators of the repertoire of the cantata says that this is a complete and confident submission to faith in God, to the will of God. And I think what I hear is a concord with all of the harmony, not a complication, not something that's difficult to discern, but something that is in full accord. bridge. You can hear there's some obvious text painting there at the end when Wogan sings sterben for die. She's low note and sustained, and then or to live, it ascends with lively rhythms. The final thing I will say before we close out is that the last movement is a standard chorale setting, standard 4-part chorale setting for the last verse of Paul Fleming's famous chorale text. What is special about it, however, is that Bach usually deploys the instruments to double the 4 parts of the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Here, however, there are 4 soprano, alto, tenor, bass parts, and there are 3 additional parts in the violin 1, 2, and viola. So it creates a 7-voice texture with descants above the soprano part. And we will leave that for the 11 o'clock hour to hear